We're back, folks, with part 2 of Lecture 17 on World War II. Because Hitler had had many years to rebuild the German military, had many years to strategize, to plan how he wanted to take over the entire continent, when the trigger was finally pulled, his use of the Blitzkrieg strategy, that means lightning war, his use of the Blitzkrieg strategy will be highly successful. The object of the Blitzkrieg or lightning war strategy was to shock your opponent so severely that they would offer little resistance. Basically, you want to overrun your enemy as quickly as possible before they have a chance to defend themselves. After taking Poland in 1940, Germany launched its next initiative by attacking Denmark and Norway, followed shortly thereafter by attacks on Belgium and the Netherlands. France was next in line. The Allied powers at this point are few. Basically, you see the United Kingdom and France are it. So Great Britain and France are the only Allied powers currently facing down Hitler. And even that doesn't last long. We'll see that Nazi troops will very quickly get behind French defensive fortifications, the Maginot Line, and will start pressing towards Paris. You can see the photograph here of Hitler in Paris by the summer of 1940. They have now taken down one of the two powers that were fighting them. And it looked like just a matter of time before the remaining Allied power, the United Kingdom or Great Britain, would fall, as Germany began an unceasing number of air raids over the island of Great Britain, trying to bomb the people into submission. As Hitler plotted his next steps, Italy, an ally of Germany, expanded the war even further by invading Greece and North Africa. Italy also made moves in the southern Mediterranean. The war in the deserts of North Africa would go on for years, one of the major campaigns of World War II, involving large numbers of forces and dramatic battles. Another Nazi Germany ally, that of Imperial Japan, has already been taking over a lot of territory in the Pacific. And what we will see is that ultimately Great Britain will get another ally in the war, and it will be the United States of America. Most of you have probably learned of the Pearl Harbor attack in December of 1941, when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the naval air station there. When that happens, the United States joins the Allied side, and they will begin deploying ships into the Pacific. They will begin working very closely with Australia as well as New Zealand and Canada. There are many other Allied forces that will ultimately join into this global war. The U.S. and its allies will also ally with China to try and evict the Japanese from the mainland. Another major power will also join the war on the Allied side. By 1941, we will see that Hitler is so confident that he can take over and has taken over much of Western Europe that now he's going to violate his non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. He feels like he's emboldened to the point where he's like, now let's go after the Soviets. And although the Germans initially made swift progress and advanced deep into the Russian heartland, the invasion of the USSR is going to prove to be the downfall, actually, of Germany's war effort. Specifically, German advances into the Soviet Union have a hard stop at the Battle of Stalingrad, fought in the last few months of 1942 into 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was a devastating 5-month battle between German and Soviet forces for the important industrial city of Stalingrad. It resulted in the deaths of almost 2 million people. The military deaths were bad enough, but the civilian deaths, you've got people that cannot get out of the city because it's surrounded by German forces. It's a bitter winter. They have no food. People are reduced to cannibalism. It's just a horrible situation. And from the standpoint of the German army, they're gonna have their troops just chewed up. Okay, the Soviets can deal with their winters. They are able to hold their own, and this is where the German troops are stopped once and for all on the Eastern Front. Now, after the Battle of Stalingrad, it's going to turn the tide of war. Now, instead of Germany advancing into Soviet territory, as they had been able to do prior to this, now Soviet forces, the Red Army, will begin chasing the Germans out of their territory. And in fact, by the time we reached the spring of 1944, the Soviet Union had not only ejected the Germans from its territory, but the Red Army showed no signs of stopping. They were now bent on revenge against the Germans who had betrayed them. Their troops have orders to get as quickly as they can to Berlin to force an end to this war. But for Western powers, France, Great Britain, and many others, the United States, they're a little worried that these communist troops are so successful. And in fact, they're worried that if these Soviet troops get to Berlin, that they may not stop there, that they may decide, you know what, we're already here. Why don't we go ahead and take over Belgium while we're here and bring it under the Soviet Union's control? Why don't we take over France or Italy? Western military leaders then began to strategize about how do we open a second front, a Western front in Europe. In other words, the Soviet Union was fighting on the Eastern Front, and they are looking for a way to land British troops, to land American troops, Canadian troops, to as a counterbalance to these Soviet troops that are descending upon Berlin. The result of coordinated planning among many Western Allied powers will be the Battle of Normandy, which will last from June of 1944 to August of 1944. This was codenamed Operation Overlord. It was to be a secretive, massive naval invasion as well as airlift of people and goods onto the beaches of Normandy. And as you can see here, it was several U.S. Army units along with several British Army units and a Canadian division as well that landed here under very heavy fire in what became known as the D-Day invasion. The Allied powers knew they were going to suffer heavy losses, and they did. But their thinking was, we just need to keep sending in troops, just overwhelm and ultimately try to storm and swarm the German military encampments. So at a heavy loss of life, it was effective. The D-Day invasion was effective at opening up a Western front in Europe. Within 3 months, 3 million American troops had landed on the beaches of Normandy. American and Allied troops had landed there, and by late August of 1944, all of northern France had been liberated, and by the following spring, the Allies had defeated the Germans. While the Western Allies had certainly enjoyed quite a bit of success in Western Europe as a result of the D-Day invasion, Japan was still fighting very, very vigorously in the Pacific theater, as it became known. In other words, while the United States and the navies of Australia, as well as New Zealand and Britain, were making some inroads, they were chasing the Japanese off of some of these islands in the Pacific. It was coming at a heavy death toll. The Japanese were, while they were being pushed back, they were showing no signs of giving up, in other words. By the summer of 1945, however, the United States will see the Manhattan Project come to fruition. The Manhattan Project was the code name for the U.S. government's secret project that was established to develop a nuclear weapon. The U.S. government had been given information at the start of the war that German scientists had already been working to create this newer, deadlier weapons technology. And now, for the United States, they understood there was a race afoot. In other words, the first one to be able to deploy this newer, much more powerful weapons technology would have a clear advantage over their enemy. So time was of the essence. By the summer of 1945, the first atomic bomb was exploded at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Then the decision came from President Harry S. Truman to deploy it in battle against the Japanese on the mainland. The United States deployed the first atomic weapon on the city of Hiroshima on August 6th. They waited several days to hear from the Japanese imperial government. Are you ready to surrender? The Japanese imperial government said nothing. They were still doubling down. Several days later, August 9th, Nagasaki was targeted by a second atomic detonation. Once more, the American government, along with the other allies, said, are you ready to give up? We will see, fortunately, that the government of Japan will ultimately decide to surrender. August 15th, 1945 is known as VJ Day, or Victory over the Japanese. The bomb had terrible effects. The acute effects of the bombing killed between 90 to 160,000 people in Hiroshima and 60 to 80,000 in Nagasaki. However, in addition to those that were killed immediately by the detonation of these bombs, we're going to see the effects of radiation poisoning, sickening many others with different types of cancers in the coming years. Ultimately, what we will see, though, is from the standpoint of the Western Allies, as the detonation of these bombs will finally conclude the war in the Pacific, and between the cooperation of the Soviet Union and many Western allies, the war in Europe had also been brought to a close. Now, what was left is to deal with the so-called atomic age. The genie is out of the bottle with the discovery of atomic weapons, and you can bet that the Soviet Union is not happy that the United States has this technology and they don't. So this will be part of the reason why we're going to see, after World War II, the development of the so-called Cold War between these two powers in particular. More on that in a future lecture.